I'm going to start this hour with some breaking news, and that is that an inquiry into the death of a woman poisoned by the Russian nerve agent Novichok says that President Putin is morally responsible. 44-year-old Dawn Sturgis died in July 2018 after accidentally spraying herself with the chemical weapon, thinking it was perfume. We are going to hear from the chair of this inquiry, that is Lord Hughes, who's going to make a statement. Let's have a listen in to what he is about to say.
Good afternoon. For those who haven't been at earlier hearings, I'm Anthony Hughes, and this has been an inquiry into the untimely death of Dawn Sturgis. It was established in March 2022 when I was appointed to chair it. The inquiry's terms of reference require me to investigate the circumstances of her death and to identify where responsibility for it lies. As that shows, my role is therefore very similar to that of a coroner who's conducting an inquest. That's not an accident. The same issues were previously being investigated in inquest proceedings until it became clear that because of an obvious link to an earlier event in Salisbury, in which a former Russian intelligence officer had been poisoned, there would be a need to consider some highly sensitive evidence, and that isn't possible in an inquest. Hence, the inquest was replaced with this public inquiry. From March 2022 until July 2024, my supporting team and I were heavily engaged in acquiring and collating evidence and in determining how much of that evidence could properly be adduced in public hearings. Those public hearings took place initially in Salisbury and then in London over about 7 weeks between October and December last year. Subsequently, I conducted some closed hearings. I've now prepared a report which I have delivered to the Home Secretary as I'm required to do. The open parts of that report are being published today. In reality, they amount to the entirety of the report, the open parts, except for one relatively confined section which addresses the sensitive evidence that I received in closed hearings. Obviously, that section can't be published, but the report does contain a little further information gathered from and about the closed hearings. In 2018, Dawn Sturgis was a private person leading a private life in Salisbury, which was the city where she'd grown up. She had a partner, Charlie Rowley. She was the mother to 3 children. She was a sister and a daughter. Her life was not without its challenges, but she faced them with the support of those she loved. And her death was needless and arbitrary. She was the entirely innocent victim of the cruel and cynical acts of others. Dawn's family has responded to her death, if I may say so, with dignity and clarity of purpose. They were determined that the full facts of her death should be uncovered, and they were prepared to bring judicial review application during the earlier inquest proceedings, and were successful in it, in order to secure that end. They have assisted this inquiry greatly. They have, if I may offer them, my deep condolences and my thanks. My conclusions as to the circumstances of Dawn's death are set out in my report. The brief summary, which I now give, is by way of introduction only. It must not be a substitute for reading the report in full. It's not a lengthy document, and it will be available online on the inquiry website, if not now, any minute. And I should make it clear that the conclusions which are set out in that report are based on the totality of the evidence I've received, both the open and the closed. Dawn Sturgis fell ill on Saturday, the 30th of June, 2018. She died some days later on the 8th of July in Salisbury District Hospital. The medical cause of her death was hypoxic ischemic brain injury and intracranial brain hemorrhage attributable to Novichok poisoning. The immediate circumstances of her death are now clear, but also quite extraordinary. On the morning of Saturday, the 30th of June 2018, Dawn and her partner, Charlie Rowley, were together at Charlie's flat in Amesbury. Charlie gave Dawn a gift of what was labelled as, and he believed to be, a small bottle of Nina Ricci perfume. He removed the packaging and attached the dispensing pump to the bottle, and using the pump, Dawn applied the substance inside the bottle, which she believed to be perfume, to her wrists, and she may well also have inhaled some of the vapours of the substance. In fact, the substance in that bottle was a deadly nerve agent from the Novichok class of organophosphate toxins. Dawn became seriously ill very quickly. Charlie called an ambulance and paramedics attended the flat. By the time they arrived, Dawn's heart had stopped beating for some time. Although the paramedics managed to resuscitate her, she had sustained unsurvivable brain injury. She received expert medical treatment in hospital, but she never regained consciousness and died some days later, as I've said, on the 8th of July. Appropriate medical care, both from the ambulance staff who responded to the emergency call and also from the hospital doctors. Having heard expert medical evidence, I'm quite sure that no medical treatment could have saved her life. The question that obviously arises is where the perfume bottle containing deadly nerve agent had come from. I'm satisfied that the answer to that question lies in events that had taken place some miles away from Amesbury, in Salisbury, and 4 months before Dawn fell ill. That is to say, on the weekend of the 3rd and 4th of March 2018. I've examined those events, those earlier events, in great detail. And in the light of all the evidence that I've received, as I say, both the open and the closed material, I am sure, that is to say, I'm satisfied beyond reasonable doubt of the following facts about the events of that earlier weekend in March. First, that weekend, an attempt was made to assassinate Sergei Skripal. Skripal was a Russian man living in Salisbury who was a former member of the Russian military intelligence known as the GRU. In 2006, that's 12 years earlier, he had been convicted in Russia on charges of spying for Britain, and he'd been imprisoned. In 2010, still 8 years earlier, he had been pardoned by Russia, and he came as part of a prisoner exchange to live in the United Kingdom. Second, 3 Russian men who were members of GRU Unit 29155 travelled to this country on Friday the 2nd of March 2018 using aliases Petrov, Bosherov and Fedotov. They came to the UK with the intention of working together to kill Sergei Skripal, and they planned to kill him using Novichok. Third, the assassination attempt itself was carried out by 2 of them, Petrov and Bosherov. They travelled to Salisbury on Saturday the 3rd of March, carried out reconnaissance of Sergei Skripal's house and the area around it. They came back to Salisbury the next day, Sunday the 4th of March, and they put Novichok on the handle of Sergei Skripal's front door with the intention that he would touch the door handle and be killed by the poison. The details of their movements are set out extensively in the report. When they did that, they must have been aware that others might also touch the door handle. Most obviously Sergei's daughter Yulia, who they knew was staying at the house at the time, but also any neighbour, visitor, delivery person, or anybody else who might chance by. Fourth, I'm satisfied that Petrov and Bosherov brought with them to Salisbury the Nina Ricci bottle containing Novichok, made in Russia, that was subsequently responsible for Dawn Sturgis's death. It was probably this bottle that they used to apply the poison to Sergei Skripal's door handle. Then, before leaving Salisbury, they recklessly discarded this bottle in some public or semi-public place. They can simply have had no regard at all to the hazard thus created, hazard of death or serious injury to an uncountable number of unconnected and innocent people. Fifth and finally, Petrov, Bosherov and Fedotov were, as I've said, members of an operational team within the GRU. I am sure that in conducting this attack on Sergei Skripal, they must have been acting on instructions received from their superiors. And I've concluded that the operation to assassinate Sergei Skripal must have been authorized at the highest level, indeed by President Putin. Moving on, I'm sure that Charlie Rowley, Dawn's partner, later came into possession of the discarded bottle of Novichok. Probably he found it somewhere. It's impossible to say exactly where and when he acquired it, but it is likely that it was within a few days of the bottle being abandoned on the 4th of March 2018. He, of course, had no idea that its contents were toxic. Whenever and wherever he acquired it, I'm sure that the perfume bottle containing Novichok that Charlie Rowley gave to Dawn Sturgis on the morning of the 30th of June 2018 with fatal consequences had been brought to Salisbury and then discarded there by Petrov and Bosharov on the 4th of March. I've considered whether Dawn Sturgis's death might have been either caused by or contributed to by conduct or failings on the part of the British authorities. The contention has been advanced on behalf of Russia that the Novichok might have emanated from the British and have been used in a deliberate attempt falsely to pin responsibility on Russia. That contention I've examined thoroughly, and the reasoning is set out in the report. But it's a contention that cannot stand up for reasons which are explained in detail in that report. There is overwhelming evidence to support my findings that the Novichok was brought to Salisbury by Russian GRU officers for the purpose of the attack on Sergei Skripal, and then discarded there, later causing the death of Dawn Sturgis. Next, questions were very properly raised on behalf of Dawn Sturgis's family as to whether the British authorities ought to have done more to protect Sergei Skripal. I've considered this issue with particular care. I have concluded that there were some failings in Sergei Skripal's management as an exchanged prisoner. In particular, sufficient regular written risk assessments were not carried out. But I am persuaded that these failings did not have any causative effect. The assessment was made that there was not a sufficient risk of an attempt at assassination on British soil by Russian agents, and that was not unreasonable in the circumstances of the time. We're talking about 2010 to 2018. Circumstances, geopolitical circumstances, were a little different from now. Some of the suggested precautions would not have prevented the kind of professional attack which was launched in any event. The arrangements which were made for Sergei Skripal took account of his own wishes, but were not dictated by them. It cannot be said that the British authorities ought to have adopted much more extreme security measures for him in effect, such as to isolate or hide him completely. I've also separately considered whether public health advice ought to have been issued sometime in the period between the Salisbury incident in March and the Amesbury incident in June, to the effect that members of the public shouldn't pick up anything that they hadn't themselves dropped. I've concluded that a decision was taken not to issue such advice at that time, largely because of the danger of causing widespread public fear and panic over a then undefinable area. And that decision was a reasonable one at the time that it was made. So, in summary, the conclusion of the report is that Dawn Sturgis died an innocent victim of an attempt by officers of a Russian state organization to conduct an assassination on the streets of Salisbury using a highly toxic nerve agent. The conduct of Petrov and Bosharov and their GRU superiors and those who authorised the mission, up to and including, as I found, President Putin, that conduct was astonishingly reckless. There is a direct causal link between the actions of all those individuals and Dawn Sturgis's death. And they, and only they, bear moral responsibility for it. I should say that I've been extremely grateful to those who gave evidence, to counsel and solicitors on all sides for their marshalling of the evidence and their very helpful submissions as to the right approach to it, and to the many people who made the vital administrative arrangements to enable the inquiry to function at all. Thank you very much.
There we go. That is Lord Hughes speaking at the end of that inquiry, concluding that the assassination attempts on a former Russian spy was authorised by Vladimir Putin, who was morally responsible for the death of that woman that you can see on your screen now, Dawn Sturgis, who was poisoned by the nerve agent Novichok in that attack back in 2018. As I say, the conclusion of the inquiry is that Vladimir Putin was morally responsible for her death and her condition was unsurvivable from a very early stage. Lord Hughes went on to say that he did not think that any medical treatment could, in fact, have saved her life. So that is the conclusion of that inquiry. Unsurprisingly, we've had a lot of political reaction to all of this in the last couple of minutes as Lord Hughes has been speaking. First of all, the UK is going to introduce new sanctions on Russia, including on the Russian military intelligence agency, the GRU, in its entirety. The UK sanctions, which exposes 11 actors behind Russian state-sponsored hostile activity, including those working for the GRU. We've also heard in the last couple of minutes that the Russian ambassador has been summoned to the Foreign Office to answer for Russia's, what the Foreign Office calls, ongoing campaign of hostility towards the United Kingdom. The Foreign Office saying that Russia's reckless attempts to sow chaos and division are today exposed as the UK announces those new sanctions aimed at dismantling Russia's spy networks. And we've also had reaction from the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer. He's issued a statement in which he says that the Salisbury poisonings shocked the nation and today's findings are a grave reminder of the Kremlin's disregard for innocent lives. Dawn's needless death was a tragedy and will forever be a reminder of Russia's reckless aggression. My thoughts are with her family and loved ones. The UK will always stand up to Putin's brutal regime and call out his murderous machine for what it is. Today's sanctions are the latest step in our unwavering defence of European security as we continue to squeeze Russia's finances and strengthen Ukraine's position at the negotiating table. And just briefly also, we've heard from the Foreign Secretary, Yvette Cooper, saying the life of a British citizen was lost and others were put dangerously at risk on British soil as a direct result of the deliberate, heinous decisions by President Putin and the GRU. Goes on to say, essentially, we will not tolerate this brazen and despicable aggression on British soil. So a lot to get through. Let's go first to our correspondent, Dan Whitehead, who's been covering this story for many years and was at a briefing before we had that news conference from Lord Hughes. And the conclusion there, Dan, that Vladimir Putin ultimately was morally responsible for Dawn's death.
Yeah, Lord Hughes determining that those Russian agents in the market city back in 2016 were given instruction from the very highest level, indeed Vladimir Putin being named as morally responsible for Dawn Sturgis's death. 7 weeks of evidence, 40 witnesses have resulted in this 174-page report, which we have been handed in the last couple of hours. The inquiry opened last year, about a year ago, with the words that Dawn Sturgis was an innocent member of the public. She was caught in the crossfire of an illegal and outrageous international assassination attempt. Let's just drill down into some of those key findings which Lord Hughes ran through there. The top line really is who ultimately was responsible for this innocent mother of three from Wiltshire's death. The inquiry found that those Russian agents, and the inquiry went through CCTV imagery in such fine detail from across Salisbury. You will remember that they claimed that they had come to Salisbury as tourists. But the inquiry said that those agents, members of Russia's GRU intelligence service, who carried out the attack on Sergei Skripal, must have been authorised at the highest level. President Vladimir Putin. The inquiry says all of them were morally responsible for Dawn Sturgis's death. Some interesting questions as well that the inquiry answered over the British government, whether the state could have done more to have prevented the attack against Sergei Skripal and in turn ultimately the fatal death, the death of Dawn Sturgis. The inquiry found there were failings in Sergei Skripal's management as an exchanged prisoner, like a lack of regular written assessments. The assessment at the time, though, that Sergei Skripal was not at significant risk of assassination was correct, according to the inquiry. Now, let's look at Dawn Sturgis's care. It was 4 months after the attempted assassination on Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia that Dawn Sturgis fell ill. The inquiry heard how her boyfriend, Charlie Rowley, called 999. She was lying in their bath, frothing at the mouth. And that is when paramedics arrived at their house in Amesbury, around 8 miles away from Salisbury. Now, the inquiry found that she received entirely appropriate medical care, both from ambulance staff and hospital doctors. It found that her condition was, in fact, unsurvivable from a very early stage and that no medical treatment could have saved her. Should first responders have been given more training between the symptoms of a drug overdose and the symptoms of a nerve agent poisoning? That was a question that was central to answers that Dawn Sturgis's family wanted answering, because there was some confusion over whether or not Dawn Sturgis had had a drug overdose at the time. In fact, Wiltshire police, before the inquiry and again in the inquiry, apologised for saying that she used drugs. That was not the case. Now, the inquiry found that before the use of a nerve agent on UK soil, there was no occasion needed for extra training on the risk of confusion between nerve agent poisoning and drug overdose. But after the attack, wider training, of course, was appropriate. The inquiry said that that training was given, but it should have been more widely circulated. The inquiry found that any training would not have had a bearing on Dawn's death. She was, quote, beyond recovery before first responders were able to reach her. Russia, of course, has always denied any involvement in the attack on Sergei Skripal and the subsequent death of Dawn Sturgis. They have described it as a blatant provocation by the British authorities aimed at discrediting Russia. But that statement that you mentioned there, Darren, from the Prime Minister, that reaction coming in as well as sanctions on the GRU, the intelligence agency, which those Russian spies were part of when they came over here to Salisbury. And important as well at this sort of final chapter, this point in the Salisbury attacks, just how much of an impact it had on the market city. You remember at the time those images of officers in hazmat suits, forensic teams across the city. It was something that had not happened on UK soil before. The use of a military-grade chemical weapon, a biological weapon being used in a rural area of the UK, targeting a former Russian spy who was living in Salisbury, and ultimately that chain of events, that perfume bottle that was found by Charlie Rowley, and 4 months after, just as that city was starting to recover, Dawn Sturgis, a completely innocent member of the public, falling ill and ultimately dying. It took the city a long time to recover, and it still continues to feel the impacts. We're going to be hearing from counter-terrorism police later on, from Wiltshire police, and I've just heard as well that we can expect some statements from the family of Dawn Sturgis later this afternoon. We'll, of course, bring you that here.
We will indeed, Dan, and we're also expecting, I think, a statement in the Commons from the Security Minister, Dan Jarvis. But I want to pick up on one of the other interesting things from this inquiry, and that's in relation to actually what Wiltshire police, or indeed counter-terrorism police, knew about Sergei Skripal in the lead-up to this attack. frankly, they didn't seem to know very much. And one of the recommendations of this report seems to be that local police should be alert to who is in their area and obviously should be alert if anything significant happens.
Yeah, and the word is failings used by Lord Hughes towards the British state as to the management of Sergei Skripal. You heard there in the statement from Lord Hughes how he had been imprisoned in Russia for treason. He was pardoned by Vladimir Putin. And then, as part of a prisoner exchange programme, came to Salisbury. But there was no name change. There was no CCTV cameras on the Skripal's house. And the inquiry heard from neighbours who gave evidence. It was an open secret that he was a former Russian spy. You could Google him and find out who Sergei Skripal was. So there are questions raised as to should the British state have carried out further protection? Counter-terrorism police, Wiltshire police, as you say, had no idea that he was living in Salisbury. The assessment at the time from authorities that he was not at risk of an assassination attempt. Now, what the inquiry found is that there isn't much more that authorities could have done, in the sense that they would have had to have put him in complete hiding. If the Russians wanted to do this, they would have found him. But there certainly there were failings in the management of their written assessments, a lack of regular written assessments by authorities as to the risk factor, essentially, of having a former Russian spy in the vicinity. So that is something that will be digested by the British government and by the likes of MI5 and MI6. That, of course, the word failings may come as some comfort to Dawn Sturgis's family, and they will hope action is being taken because, of course, if better protection had been offered to Sergei Skripal, ultimately Dawn Sturgis may still be here today.
OK, Dan, we appreciate that. Dan Whitehead there, who is at that inquiry in central London. It's just after 12:30. You're watching Sky News. Just to remind you that in the last couple of minutes, Lord Hughes' inquiry has found that the death of Dawn Sturgis, that woman poisoned by the Russian nerve agent Novichok, is essentially because Vladimir Putin is morally responsible for her death. We've also had a lot of reaction. Just to remind you that the UK has announced new sanctions against Russia's military intelligence agency. The Russian ambassador has been summoned to the Foreign Office, and the Prime Minister has said that this is shocking, and today's findings are a grave reminder of the Kremlin's disregard for innocent lives. Well, let's take you through some of the key points from that report. And it says that the initial attack by the three Russian agents on the double agent Sergei Skripal would have been authorised by President Putin, making him, as I said, morally responsible. In terms of the failings, the inquiry found that there were failings in Sergei Skripal's management as an exchange prisoner. And after spraying herself with a perfume bottle containing the nerve agent Novichok, the report says that no medical treatment could have saved her life, and that the perfume bottle had enough Novichok to kill thousands. Well, joining me now from Salisbury is the former head of the British Army's Chemical Weapons Unit. That's Hamish de Bretton-Gorton. A very good afternoon to you again, Hamish. It's good to see you. I mean, this report is pretty shocking, if in many ways also unsurprising.
Yeah, I think so, and I think we're delighted in a way that it has actually really looked at some of the really challenging issues. That the headline issue, as you mentioned there, this was authorised at the very highest level. These sort of weapons of mass destruction have to be signed off in Russia by the president. So the report says Putin is morally responsible for the death of Dawn Sturgis, and that's absolutely right. It wouldn't have happened without his say-so. And we're in a very different geopolitical time today as we were back in 2018, which I suppose in a way, going back to, did we do all that we could to have protected any of these sort of double agents who've come to this country under the sort of exchange scheme, and the people of Salisbury in this case? I think one just has to remember at the time, as has come out in the report, appropriate measures were taken. Very different now. Of course, Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia have now not been heard of for the last 7 years because they've had to be hidden away. And that is another element of the collateral damage that Putin has caused, and the callous nature. And the other element you're talking about there is the fact that this quarter of an egg cup, if you like, of this deadly nerve agent could have killed thousands of people in Salisbury. But unfortunately, President Putin, as we're seeing in Ukraine at the moment, has no regard for civilian casualties or collateral damage. So I think this report is welcome. It'll be, very little solace, no doubt, for the family of Dawn Sturgis, but it really shows us what we are up against and the sort of people that the Russian state are at the moment. And let's hope that we take more notice this time than perhaps we have in the past when the Russians have conducted these sort of attacks like Alexei Litvinenko back in the early 2000s.
Yeah, on that, Hamish, given the fact that Russia obviously does have a past history of this, why wasn't there more sensitivity around the Skripals and others? I mean, I suspect that has now changed, but it does seem a rather lax approach, just under a decade ago?
Well, that is a very good point. And I don't want to be finicky about it, but it's a very different situation between Litvinenko and Sergei Skripal. Sergei Skripal was a double agent. He was handed over in a prisoner exchange. And dare I say, the rules involved in these sort of exchanges, once people have been exchanged, they are then left alone to live a life as long as they don't get involved in espionage again. And as far as we know, Sergei Skripal hadn't. He was just part of Putin's attempt to really put a marker down for what the Russian Federation is about. Litvinenko was somebody who was in this country, but was very much in opposition to Putin. And although he was an ex-Russian spy himself, there is no indication that he was working for the UK at all. So different times, absolutely. And as you say now, I think the situation is very, very different. And the emergency services have had the requisite training that the report suggests that they have. And no doubt the counter-terror police, I'm sure you'll hear from later, have changed their operating procedures to make these sort of things less likely. But we need to be absolutely clear. We are in a hybrid war with Russia. The ex-head of MI5, Dane Manningham-Buller, said this only last month. And I think it's very clear. And other experts like me have said, this is not just a crime. This was an act of war. And that is pretty salutary. And this report has underlined that and has really come out with, what actually happened. And this is something that people need to ingest, in its complete entirety.
Hamish, what do you make of today's announcement around these sanctions? I mean, how effective can they be, given, I suppose, how dire relations are? I mean, the Russian ambassador has also been called into the Foreign Office for addressing down, but, I mean, relations with Russia are pretty bad at the moment. What practical impact does sanctioning members of Russia's intelligence military units actually achieve?
Well, I think it's very difficult, and sanctions, have limited effect, as we've already seen, sanctioning the Russian shadow fleet selling oil all around the world. But it is a marker in the sand. I think, politically, and we talk about the geopolitical situation at the moment, it is saying that we're taking this very seriously. And we know that the three people involved in this, the GRU agents, have been unable to leave Russia ever since because they are being looked out for. So there is little that we can do, but I think it is what the government must do by saying what a despicable act this was, and also so the population of this country know that what we're up against with the Russian Federation. Quite far apart from the Russian Federation trying to protect itself, we're seeing it trying to expand in Europe. And we need to be aware of that. And it's something that is a reminder that, unfortunately, Putin sees us as an enemy. And even 7 years ago, he was prepared to kill people in Britain to underwrite that. So we're in challenging times. The main thing is, the key thing about Putin we've learned is that he exploits weakness and he only respects strength. And strength is what we must show him.
And Hamish, in my introduction to you, I, talked about the fact that you were the former head of the British Army's Chemical Weapons Unit. And I just want to, before we let you go, pick up on something you just said a couple of minutes ago about just how deadly Novichok is. That small perfume bottle that very sadly killed Dawn Sturgis, but as Lord Hughes pointed out, could have potentially killed thousands of people in Salisbury.
Well, that's right. This is a deadly nerve agent that the Russians developed specifically so that it couldn't be detected by NATO equipment, that it was very long-lasting, very persistent, and very deadly. And to try and give an example, something like chlorine that people will be aware of, if that is toxicity, say, level 1, Novichok is about 10,000. So it's incredibly toxic, which is why so very callous. We saw Litvinenko poisoned and killed with polonium, which would not have an impact that Novichok would potentially. We've seen the Russians use various other methods to assassinate people who are against them. But the thing about this, it could have been incredibly desperate, and as many others have said, it could have killed thousands. And are concerned with the Russians using industrial amounts of chemical weapons in Ukraine at the moment. If they started using something like this, that would be devastating. But these are illegal under the Chemical Weapons Convention, and it's very important that people are held to account. And this is yet another war crime, another crime against humanity that needs to be added to Putin's list.
OK, Hamish, as always, we appreciate your time and your insights this afternoon here on Sky News. That's Hamish de Bretton-Gordon there, joining us live from Salisbury. Well, in the last, 40 minutes or so, we have heard from Lord Hughes, who chaired that inquiry, holding Vladimir Putin morally responsible for the death of Dawn Sturgis. Let's have a listen in, just a reminder of what Lord Hughes had to say a little earlier this hour.
Dawn Sturgis died an innocent victim of an attempt by officers of a Russian state organisation to conduct an assassination on the streets of Salisbury using a highly toxic nerve agent. The conduct of Petrov and Bolsharov and their GRU superiors and those who authorised the mission, up to and including, as I found, President Putin, that conduct was astonishingly reckless. There is a direct causal link between the actions of all those individuals and Dawn Sturgis's death. And they, and only they, bear moral responsibility for it.
Lord Hughes speaking there. Let's bring in our political correspondent, Mara Aurora, who's live for us in Westminster, because there's been a lot of political reaction, not least of all from the government, clearly. We've had a statement through from the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary, and of course the Russian ambassador has been called into the Foreign Office.
Yeah, absolutely right, Dareth. So, Darren, excuse me, I'm getting confused with Gareth. The thing that I think that's really interesting about this is we've seen a lot of Russian sanctions since, of course, the war in Ukraine. And this is focused on something slightly different, but with the same agenda. So, as you were saying, completely and utterly sanctioning the GRU in its entirety, but also those 11 actors who are seen to be behind this kind of hostile activity against the UK. 8 of which are cyber military intelligence officers for being sanctioned for working for the GRU directly. Let me just read you what the Prime Minister has said in his statement. He said the Salisbury poisonings shocked the nation, and today's findings are a grave reminder of the Kremlin's disregard for innocent lives. Dawn's needless death was a tragedy and will forever be a reminder of Russians' reckless aggression. My thoughts are with her family and loved ones. The UK will always stand up to Putin's brutal regime and call out his murderous machine for what it is. Today's sanctions are the latest step in our unwavering defence of European security, and we recognise and we continue to squeeze Russia's finances and strengthen Ukraine's position at the negotiating table. So you can see the Prime Minister there at the end of that statement, bringing it full circle back to the war in Ukraine and what Russia and Putin are doing right now, as well as of course, that Novichok attack in 2018. And then the Foreign Secretary, Yvette Cooper, she's given us a statement. I won't read it all to you, but there is a section where she talks about Putin and the GRU having an active threat to Britain's citizens, security and our prosperity. So really not beating around the bush there. And she talks about brazen and despicable aggression from Russia on British soil. And also the Home Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, has also issued a statement. And again, I won't read it whole to you, but just to give you a flavour, she talks about how it was an attack, that Novichok attack was an attack on our country and our values. And she said there was a complete disregard from the Russian state for human life and international law. So incredibly stern words there from the Labour government on these sanctions and why they think these are justified after that report. We are waiting to hear from opposition parties, from, of course, Priti Patel, the Shadow Home Foreign Secretary, but also Boris Johnson, who was Foreign Secretary at the time of that Novichok attack in 2018 as well.
Yeah, Mara, we should say the Russian government obviously has always denied its involvement in these poisonings. And we'll have to see, of course, what the Russian ambassador is going to say at that dressing down in the Foreign Office. But it is also a reminder today, isn't it, of how difficult, how bad, effectively, relations are. I mean, they, at such a low ebb between Russia and the United Kingdom. It's been the case for a while. But also, as you say, what was interesting is the Prime Minister relating this attack to what's happening today in Ukraine.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know that, for instance, the Prime Minister is going to be having meetings with, the Norwegians about defence today, for instance. European partners are starting to really kind of team together and realise that perhaps they need to step up. And that's why we've seen an increase in defence spending in lots of European nations, more collaboration in defence procurement, for instance. And that's why you're seeing this general move because of Russian aggression, and therefore this is considered to be one of many examples of Russia's increasingly hostile and unfriendly, to say the least, actions toward, yes, the UK, but actually the rest of Europe as a whole as well. And I think the Prime Minister there, relating that back to Ukraine, trying to remind people as well, at a time when there's nervousness around the fate of Ukraine and what the Americans might decide or push on the Ukrainians in any deal that might be brokered, is the fact that the UK government wants to remind partners across the pond that Russia, to an extent, is the bad guy. Russia is the aggressor, and Russia is the person, the figure in the wrong here. And so actually reminding people of these heinous attacks, killing innocent civilians here on UK soil and putting so many more in danger, will be a reminder of the kinds of things that Russia can do and has done.
OK, Mari, thank you very much indeed for joining us there. Live from Westminster, reminder of that breaking news in the last hour or so, that the long-awaited report into the death of Dawn Sturgis, who was poisoned by that Russian nerve agent Novichok in Salisbury, has found Vladimir Putin of being morally responsible for her death. As we've also just been reporting, we're expecting to hear from the security services, from Dawn Sturgis's family, and indeed from the security minister all throughout the afternoon here on Sky News. We'll bring you that live as we continue to follow this developing story. Stay tuned.